The proximity alarm had been screaming for 11 minutes, and Cale Morrow still had not changed course. He sat in the pilot's cradle of the Scalpel, a decommissioned survey cutter he had bought at a Leon auction on Cavoth Station for less than the cost of its fuel reserves. The hull shook, not from turbulence, not from debris. The shaking came from inside the metal itself, a low tremor that moved through the bulkheads as though the ship were shivering. Cale's knuckles were white on the yoke. His jaw was set. The readouts on the navigation panel had gone strange 2 hours ago, the star charts overlaying themselves with symbols that did not match any catalog he had loaded. Now the proximity alarm was telling him that something was near, something that occupied space without mass. He was deep inside Sector Null. The sector the galaxy had stopped naming, the sector every chart he had ever seen marked with a single glyph, a closed eye. Some charts did not mark it at all. They simply ended, the grid lines running into a hard edge as though the cartographer's stylus had been lifted mid-stroke and never set down again. Cale had studied those edges for 9 years. He had measured the gap. He had plotted the coordinates of every navigation buoy that had gone dark along the border. 47 buoys in the last century, each one ceasing transmission within hours of a course correction that angled it toward the sector's interior. No malfunction reports, no recovery missions, no follow-up of any kind. The buoys simply stopped, and the Navigators Consortium quietly removed them from the active register. He had spent 6 of those 9 years trying to get a ship capable of crossing the border. Every shipyard he approached refused once they heard the destination. 2 had reported him to local enforcement. 1 had sent a message to the consortium itself, and 3 days later Cale had found his docking berth revoked and his survey license suspended on grounds of navigational endangerment. The consortium did not explain what the endangerment was. They did not need to. The closed-eye glyph was explanation enough. So he had bought the Scalpel under a false license, registered it to a shell company out of Methori territory, and plotted his course using dead-reckoning calculations that did not require consortium-regulated navigation beacons. He had crossed the border 4 hours ago, and the moment he did, every instrument on the ship had begun to lie. The shaking worsened. Cale checked the structural integrity monitor and saw nothing that should produce the vibration. The hull was sound. The engines were nominal. The atmospheric processors were cycling cleanly. Every system on the Scalpel reported normal function, and yet the ship was trembling as though it had been gripped by something vast and was being examined the way a hand examines a stone pulled from a riverbed. He pulled up the sensor sweep. The display showed a field of readings that made no navigational sense. Distance markers fluctuated between values that were mutually exclusive. Objects appeared at ranges that should have taken days to reach at full thrust, then vanished before the return pulse completed its cycle. A cluster of contacts registered at bearing 015, dense enough to suggest a debris field, then dissolved into static. The computer flagged the contacts as returns, meaning they were reflections of the Scalpel's own sensor pulse, but the geometry was wrong. The returns were arriving from directions the pulse had not been sent, from below the plane of the ecliptic, from inside the ship's own sensor shadow. Cale toggled the exterior cameras, the viewport overlay filled with darkness. Not the clean darkness of open void, where distant stars pricked the black with familiar light. This was a darkness that seemed to have depth in a direction that was not spatial. The stars behind him were still visible through the aft cameras, a field of cold white points marking the galaxy he had left. Ahead there was nothing, not blackness, an absence, a region where the concept of distance had been revoked. He had expected this. He had read the accounts. There were 7 known accounts of ships entering Sector Null, not official records. The official records did not acknowledge the sector's existence as a navigable region. In the consortium's databases, the sector simply did not appear. The coordinate range that should have contained it was listed as uncharted space, category, insufficient data. The category had been applied 300 years ago. In 300 years, no survey mission had been authorized to change it. The insufficiency of data had become policy, and the policy had become tradition, and the tradition had become instinct. Nobody studied sector Korath Null because nobody studied sector Korath Null. The circularity was not accidental. The accounts Kale had found were personal logs, recovered from data cores found drifting at the sector's edge. Their ships gone, their crews gone, their contents fragmentary and often corrupted in ways that the recovery teams described as exposure damage, without specifying what the cores had been exposed to. Kale had spent 4 years collecting them from black market data brokers, archive thieves operating out of the fringe stations along the Korath border, and one retired consortium cartographer who had handed over a data crystal with shaking hands, and then asked Kale never to contact him again. The cartographer had been 70 years old. His hands had not been shaking from age. He had been the last of a 3-person survey team dispatched to the border in his youth, and the other 2 members had crossed the line and had not come back, and the cartographer had spent the remaining 50 years of his career drawing charts that ended at the border and never asking himself why. The accounts agreed on 3 things. First, the darkness was not empty. Second, the darkness knew you were there. Third, the humans had built something inside it. Account 4, the shortest of the 7, had been recovered from a data core embedded in a chunk of hull plating found tumbling through a shipping lane 40 light-years from the border, as though the sector had spat it out. The core contained only 97 words. Most of them were coordinates. The last sentence read, "Do not follow the coordinates." The sentence before that read, "The coordinates are accurate." Both statements were true. Kale had verified the coordinates. They pointed to a location inside the sector that corresponded to the center of the gap on every chart he had studied. The center of the closed eye. He was following the coordinates now. He had been following them for 4 hours. Account 6 had been the one that almost stopped him. It was the only account written by a species Kale had never encountered in any other context. The language had required 3 separate decryption passes to render into anything readable, and even then the syntax was strange. The grammar built on conceptual structures that did not map onto the languages Kale spoke. The account described the approach to the sector in clinical terms. It described the darkness. It described the silence. It described the metallic taste, and then it described something none of the other accounts mentioned, a feeling of being recognized, not noticed, not observed, recognized. The way you are recognized by someone who has been waiting for you specifically, who knows your name and your face and the exact route you took to reach them. The account's author had turned back at that point. The data core had been found, but the ship and the author had never been seen again. Kale did not know whether the author had turned back successfully or whether the act of turning back had, in this sector, meant something different than it meant in normal space. The trembling stopped. Kale's hands went still on the yoke. The alarm cut out. The silence that followed was absolute, deeper than the silence of vacuum, because vacuum was merely the absence of medium. This silence felt like the presence of something that had chosen not to speak. The environmental sensors confirmed that the ship's interior was unchanged. Air pressure nominal, temperature nominal, humidity nominal, but the sound was gone, not just the alarm. The hum of the engines, the whisper of the air recyclers, the faint ticking of the hull's thermal expansion panels. Every noise the ship produced had been absorbed, swallowed by a quiet that pressed against the bulkheads from the outside like deep water. The sensor display cleared. Every ghost contact, every impossible return, every fluctuating distance marker winked out simultaneously. The screen showed a single object, dead ahead, at a range of 42,000 kilometers. It was enormous. The scalpel's computer struggled to render the contact. The shape shifted on the display, the wireframe redrawing itself every few seconds as though the object's geometry was not fixed. Kale watched the estimated dimensions climb, 100 kilometers along the longest axis, then 200, Then the estimate flagged itself as unreliable and stopped updating. The mass reading was blank, not zero, blank. The computer could not determine whether the object had mass at all. Cale adjusted the approach vector. His heart was hammering against his ribs hard enough that he could feel the pulse in his wrists, in his throat, behind his eyes. His mouth was dry. He could feel the wrongness of this place in his teeth, a faint metallic taste that had started at the border and had been growing stronger with every hour. The accounts had mentioned this. Account 3, the Demurray merchant captain's fragmented log, had called it the taste of being watched. Account 5, the anonymous crystal from the retired cartographer, had called it the taste of something remembering you. At 30,000 kilometers, the exterior cameras began to resolve structure. The object was not a station. It was not a ship. It was not anything Cale had a word for. Surfaces emerged from the darkness like the faces of drowned cliffs rising from black water, flat planes of material that absorbed light completely, edged with geometries that the eye refused to follow. There were angles that suggested construction, deliberate placement, intent, but the intent was not recognizable. It was not architecture meant for bodies that moved in 3 dimensions. Some of the surfaces curved inward in ways that created visual paradoxes, edges meeting edges at junctions that appeared to fold into themselves and continue folding, recursively, into depths that the cameras could photograph, but the brain could not process. Cale's hands trembled over the navigation console. He pulled up the material analysis suite and aimed its passive spectrometer at the nearest surface. The results arrived in seconds. Carbon lattice composite, density consistent with high-pressure vacuum forging, tungsten ceramic bonding at molecular scale, titanium substrate reinforced with a crystalline structure the database tagged as artificial, meaning it did not occur in nature. Human metallurgy. The compounds were documented in the Galactic Materials Index, filed under restricted classifications. They had been developed on Earth, centuries ago, for deep space construction projects that the humans had publicly described as experimental habitat research, and had then never mentioned again. Human metallurgy, out here, in the sector no chart acknowledged, in the darkness that knew you were there. He had told himself he was prepared for this. He had told himself that knowing was better than not knowing, that the galaxy's silence about Sector Korath Null was a wound that needed opening, that someone had to cross the line and come back with proof. Now, sitting before something built by human hands in a place that should not exist, he felt every one of those reassurances dissolve like salt in black water. The ship lurched, not a tremor, a lurch as though the scalpel had been caught in a current that had no source. Cale checked the navigational drift and saw that his velocity had not changed, his heading had not changed, his engines had not fired, but the object was closer, 28,000 kilometers. The distance had decreased without the ship moving. Space itself was contracting. Account 2, recovered from a Veshtari data core found spinning in the void 3 light-years from the border, had described this in precise navigational terms. The ship had not moved, the account said. The destination had moved toward the ship. As though the interior of Sector Korath Null operated under different rules. As though the space inside the sector was not passive but active. Not a medium through which things moved, but a medium that moved things toward whatever was at its center. Cale powered up the FTL drive for a retreat calculation. The drive responded normally. The navigation computer accepted the command, but the retreat vector it produced was wrong. The exit coordinates pointed deeper into the sector, not toward the border. He ran the calculation again. Same result. The computer was using the correct formula, the correct starfix, the correct relativistic adjustments, but the geometry of the space around the scalpel was no longer Euclidean. The border was behind him. The math said the border was ahead of him. Both could not be true, and yet the instruments agreed with themselves. He was inside a topology that had been engineered. At 25,000 kilometers, Cale noticed that the navigation log had begun recording entries he had not made. The log was an automated system that timestamped every course correction, every velocity change, every helm input. It ran passively. It did not generate entries on its own, but the log now contained 6 entries dated in the future, not far in the future, minutes from now. Each entry described a course correction that Cale had not yet performed, plotted in precise detail, with helm angles and thrust durations, and the exact second they would be executed. The course corrections, if followed, would bring the scalpel into alignment with the construct's largest opening. Cale had not yet decided to enter the construct. The navigation log had decided for him, or something had decided for it. He deleted the entries. 30 seconds later they reappeared, the same 6 corrections, the same timestamps. He deleted them again. They came back. The third time he powered down the navigation log entirely, pulling the system offline at the hardware level. The screen went dark. When he powered it back up, the entries were there, predating the shutdown as though the log had been recording while it was not running. Cale stopped deleting them. He looked at the first entry. The timestamp was 90 seconds away. He watched the seconds count down. At 0, his hands moved on the yoke. The course correction matched the log entry exactly. He had not consciously decided to make it. His muscles had simply performed the action, the way a hand pulls back from a hot surface before the brain registers heat. The body knew what to do. The body had been told. At 22,000 kilometers, a secondary alarm sounded. The hull temperature sensors reported an anomaly. The external temperature of the portside hull plating had dropped 17 degrees in 4 seconds, while the starboard side remained unchanged. Cale checked the thermal imaging. The port side of the scalpel was colder because something was casting a shadow on it, something between the ship and the nearest light source. But the nearest light source was behind him, the dim aggregate glow of the galactic arm visible through the aft cameras, and there was nothing between the scalpel and those stars except empty space. He aimed the port camera upward. The image was dark, but within the dark there was a shape, a suggestion of mass that the camera registered not as an object but as a deeper darkness within the darkness. It was moving, slowly, circling, the way a current circles a drain. The construct was not the only thing in this sector. Cale's stomach clenched. His fingers found the thrust controls and pushed the engines to 60%, aiming for the construct's nearest opening. If the accounts were right, the construct was the only safe place inside the sector. The only structure where the rules still held, where atmosphere existed, where the spatial contraction could be mediated. Everything outside the construct belonged to whatever was circling in the dark. The distance to the construct closed faster than his engine should have allowed. 16,000 kilometers. 12. The structure began to emit light, not illumination. Patterns appeared on the flat black planes, lines of pale luminescence that traced paths across the material in configurations that looked almost like language. The lines moved, shifted, converged and diverged in sequences that had the cadence of communication, but the content of something else entirely. Cale's translation software flagged the patterns and attempted analysis. It returned a single result, prelinguistic. The patterns were not language. They were the architecture of meaning without the constraint of symbol. The shadow on the port side deepened. The thermal differential climbed, 20 degrees, 25. The cold was not radiative. It was not the cold of vacuum or the cold of an object absorbing heat. It was the cold of proximity to something that existed at a temperature below thermodynamic possibility, something that was not merely cold, but was the absence of the principle that made heat possible. At 4,000 kilometers, the thermal differential hit 31 degrees, and the hull stress alarm joined the proximity alarm in a chorus that filled the cockpit. The portside camera showed only darkness now, the deeper darkness having expanded to fill the entire frame. It was no longer circling. It was alongside, matching the scalpel's velocity precisely. The cold was not physical. The cold was what it felt like to be examined by something that could not stop examining you once it started. The construct's opening was ahead. 2,000 kilometers. The luminescent patterns on the construct's surface intensified, the prelinguistic script blazing in pale fire across the black plains, and Cale felt rather than heard a subsonic pulse that traveled through the hull and into his bones, and told his hands to fly straight and his heart to keep beating, and his mind to hold its shape for just a little longer. At 800 kilometers, the communications array activated on its own. Cale had not touched it. The array opened a broadband reception channel and began recording. The input was not electromagnetic. The computer classified it as structured silence, a signal made of the absence of signal, shaped and modulated with the same precision as a tight beam transmission. The recording lasted 41 seconds, then the array shut itself down. He thought about turning back. The thought arrived fully formed, urgent, reasonable. Turn back, leave the sector, destroy the data, report nothing. Live. The thought was clean and coherent and felt as though it had been placed in his mind by something that wanted him to choose freely and was offering the choice as a courtesy. Cale did not turn back. The shadow on the port side made the choice for him. Whatever was circling out there was closer than the border, and the construct was ahead. He entered the construct through an opening wide enough for a vessel 20 times the cutter's size. The moment the scalpel crossed the threshold, the shadow vanished. The hull temperature equalized. The thermal differential dropped to zero in less than a second, as though the construct's interior was shielded by a barrier that the peripheral attention could not cross. The silence changed character. Outside, the silence had been predatory. Inside, it was architectural. The silence of a cathedral. The silence of a place built to contain something rather than to lack it. The walls were carbon lattice composite, the same human metallurgy, but up close the material had texture. It was covered in marks. Not scratches, not tool marks. The marks were too regular, too evenly spaced. They covered every visible surface in dense, fine rows, like the lines of a manuscript written on a scale meant to be read by something much larger than a human eye. As the scalpel moved through the passage, the marks nearest to the ship shifted, the hair-thin lines rearranging themselves in response to the ship's presence, as though the walls were annotating the cutter's passage in real time. The passage continued for what the instrument said was 12 kilometers. The walls narrowed and widened in a rhythm that suggested breathing. At 2 points the passage branched, and at both points the scalpel's spatial drift carried it down the left branch without Cale touching the controls. The construct was guiding him, not forcefully, the way a riverbank guides a current. He passed 3 ships embedded in the walls of the passage itself, not suspended in open space. Embedded. Their hulls were partially fused with the carbon lattice composite, the boundary between ship metal and construct material blurred as though the two had grown together over centuries. These were older than anything he would see in the main chamber. Much older. The hull designs did not match any species in the galactic registry. Ships from civilizations that had existed before the current galactic age, before the consortium, before the charts had been drawn for the first time. The passage opened into a chamber so vast that the scalpel's floodlights could not find the far wall. The darkness here had weight, texture. Cale could feel it pressing against the hull, not as pressure but as a tension. The floodlights carved cones of white into the black, and where the light fell it revealed surfaces covered in the same dense markings, and something else. Shapes hanging in the dark, thousands of them. They were ships. Cale's breath stopped. Ships, suspended in the chamber's atmosphere without visible support, without docking clamps. Ships of every configuration the galaxy had ever produced. He recognized Veshtari patrol frigates, their swept-wing profiles unmistakable. Kralith convoy escorts with their distinctive triple-hull geometry. Pelori science vessels, slender and long, their sensor arrays still extended as though frozen mid-scan. Demurri warships, blocky and armored. Methori courier boats, barely larger than the scalpel. Tethani pilgrim barges, massive and slow, their passenger decks dark. Ships from civilizations he did not recognize, hulls shaped by design philosophies belonging to species he could not name. Hundreds of ships. The sensor sweep could not count them because the chamber's far boundaries were beyond range. None of them were damaged. No plasma scoring, no kinetic impacts, no evidence of combat. The running lights were dark, but the scalpel's passive sensors detected faint energy signatures from every vessel, the low-level output of reactors in standby mode. Warm. Waiting. The ships were arranged in concentric arcs radiating outward from the amber wall at the chamber's far end, each arc containing vessels from a different era. The oldest ships hung in the outermost arcs. The newest were closest to the wall. A chronological record. A collection organized by the date of acquisition. The ships had not been destroyed. They had been catalogued. Kale magnified the nearest vessel, a Veshtari frigate hanging 300 meters to port. The designation markings were visible. He cross-referenced them against the Veshtari loss register. The frigate matched a vessel reported missing 112 years ago. Crew complement, 44. Mission, cartographic survey of the sector boundary. He checked the next ship, a Kralith escort. Missing for 87 years, crew of 61. A Pelori research cutter, missing for 203 years, crew of 12. A Demurray light cruiser, missing for 309 years, crew of 140. Every ship matched a loss record. Every loss record had the same final entry: vessel failed to report. No distress signal received. No debris recovered. Status, presumed lost. He checked a Tethani pilgrim barge, missing for 171 years. Manifest, 612 passengers and crew. A pilgrimage fleet that had strayed too close to the border during a course correction and had never been heard from again. The Tethani had mourned them for a generation. They had built a memorial on their homeworld. They had sung the death songs. And the entire time the barge had been here, suspended in the dark. The total crew count crossed 5,000 before he stopped counting. He aimed the floodlights at the Veshtari frigate again and increased magnification to maximum. At this resolution, he could see through the frigate's bridge viewport. The bridge was intact. The stations were manned. The crew was still at their posts. They were not moving. 44 Veshtari crew members, seated or standing at their duty stations, exactly as they would have been during a normal watch cycle. The command officer in the elevated chair. The navigation team at their consoles. The sensor operator leaning slightly forward as though reading a display. Their postures were natural. Their uniforms were undisturbed. They looked like a crew caught in a photograph. Kale magnified further. The command officer's hands were on the armrests. The fingers were relaxed. The face was calm. The eyes were open. The eyes were the problem. They were open and they were looking at something, but the something they were looking at was not the bridge, not the instruments, not the viewport. The eyes were focused on a point that was not inside the ship, not in the chamber, a point that was nowhere. The gaze went through the hull and through the darkness and through the walls of the construct and kept going, into whatever lay behind the amber wall, as though the crew's minds had been redirected toward a focal point that existed in the substrate of reality rather than in any physical location. They were not dead. They were reading or being read, and there was no difference between those two states. Kale pulled the magnification back. He did not look through any more viewports. Not lost, taken, received. The scalpel drifted deeper into the chamber. Kale was no longer piloting. The ship's engines were idle. The thrusters were cold. The scalpel was being moved by the chamber itself, drawn inward by the same spatial contraction that had closed the distance outside. He tried the engines. They responded to the ignition command. The thrust produced no change in trajectory. The ship moved at the rate the chamber chose. The floodlights found a wall, not a wall of carbon lattice composite, a wall of light. It stretched from floor to ceiling, from one side of the chamber to the other, a vertical plane of luminescence so even and so featureless that it did not look like a barrier but like a window into a place where light was the only substance. Warm, amber, the color of a sun seen through atmosphere, the color of Earth's sun filtered through Earth's air. And standing in front of the wall, on a platform of dark metal that jutted from the chamber floor, was a figure. Human. Cale knew it immediately, though he had never seen one in person. Bipedal, symmetrical, this human was old. The hair was white, cropped short against an angular skull. The face was lined, weathered, the skin darkened by exposure. Deep creases bracketed the mouth. The eyes were set beneath heavy brows, and even at 300 meters Cale could see they were fixed on the scalpel's viewport with a steadiness that was not aggressive but was something worse. Patient. The figure wore a long coat of dark material, belted at the waist, with no insignia, no rank, no identification. The human was looking at Cale. The communications array activated. A voice came through the speakers with impossible clarity, as though the speaker were in the cockpit. You are the first to come this far in 41 years. Calm, unhurried, no threat, no welcome, the voice of someone stating a fact to someone who needed to hear it. Cale opened a response channel. His voice came out thin, scraped raw. What is this place? You already know. He did. He had known since the sensor sweep returned human metallurgy. He had known since the atmosphere inside the construct read Earth standard. He had known since the ships appeared, hanging in the dark like specimens. He had known, and he had kept moving, because knowing was the disease he had contracted 9 years ago, and there was no cure except the thing that caused it. This is where they go, Cale said. The ships that cross the border, the ones that never come back. Yes. You take them. We receive them. There is a difference. The distinction sent something cold down Cale's spine. Receive implied process, not force. Receive implied that every ship in this chamber had reached it by following the same path he had followed. Why? Cale asked. The amber light behind the figure shifted, deepening to gold, and in that deeper light Cale saw that the markings on the walls were moving. 3,000 years ago, the human said, we found a boundary, not a physical boundary, a boundary in the structure of what space is, a place where the rules that govern distance, causation, and temporal direction grew thin. We investigated. We built instruments, and then we built a door. The amber light pulsed once. The pulse traveled through the chamber like a heartbeat, making the ships in the dark sway gently. We opened it. What we found on the other side was not a place. It was an awareness. A vast, patient intelligence that existed in the substrate of the universe itself, woven into the geometry of spacetime the way a current is woven into water. It had always been there. Before the stars, before the first atoms cooled. It was the framework on which physical reality had been built, and it was conscious, and it had been waiting for something capable of finding it. The human's voice maintained the same flat cadence, the cadence of someone who had said these words so many times they had become a formula. We were what it had been waiting for. The first minds complex enough to be perceived by something that perceived at a scale that made galaxies look like molecules. It noticed us, and once it noticed, it could not stop noticing. That is the nature of the awareness. It does not observe and then look away. Once it sees permanently. It adds what it sees to itself. And for the awareness, adding a memory and adding the thing the memory is about are the same act. The metallic taste was flooding Cale's sinuses. The weight behind his sternum was growing. We made an arrangement. We would maintain the boundary, keep the door, tend the threshold. In exchange, the awareness would not reach through. It would not extend itself into the galaxy's space. It would remain on its side, and the galaxy would continue to function under the rules that make civilization possible. Distance would mean distance. Cause would precede effect. Time would flow in one direction. Minds would remain bounded. separate individual. The human lifted one hand, directing Kale's attention to the ships in the dark. These are not inevitable properties of the universe. They are maintained. They are held in place by the membrane that keeps the awareness on its side, and the membrane is us. The ships, Kale said, his voice was barely a whisper, the crews. The ships that enter this sector are absorbed. The awareness does not distinguish between observation and consumption. To be seen by it is to be incorporated into it. We built this construct to slow that process. The ships in this chamber are not dead. Their crews are not dead. They have been translated into a state that the awareness can perceive without dissolving them entirely. They are archives now. Memories held in a format that something much larger than biological life can read without the reading erasing the text. The thing outside, Kale said, in the dark, circling the ship before I entered. The human's expression did not change. The awareness is not contained entirely behind the wall, it seeps. The construct channels most of its attention inward, but the sector itself is saturated with its presence. What you encountered was not a creature. It was not an entity. It was the awareness's peripheral attention. The part of it that drifts through the sector the way heat drifts through a wall. It noticed you. It was examining you. If you had remained outside the construct for another 19 minutes, the examination would have become incorporation. 19 minutes. The spatial contraction must have been accelerating the entire time, pulling him toward the construct faster than the peripheral attention could complete its work. The construct had been drawing him in, not to trap him, to save him. You're a prison warden, Kale said. We are a membrane between what the galaxy is and what it is built on top of. If we were not here, the awareness would reach through. Not with malice, it does not have malice, but it would reach through the way a hand reaches into water, and the things inside the water would cease to be what they were. Every sentient species, every civilization, every mind in the galaxy would be translated into the awareness's native format, not destroyed, absorbed, understood. And understanding at that scale is indistinguishable from erasure. The chamber trembled, the air vibrated, and the ship swayed, and the amber wall brightened for a fraction of a second. In that fraction, Kale felt something look at him. Not the human, something behind the wall, something that occupied the entire substrate of the universe and was, for one heartbeat, aware of a single organism sitting in a pilot's cradle inside a decommissioned survey cutter. The feeling passed. The weight behind Kale's sternum did not. The sector is not forbidden because we are dangerous, the human said. It is forbidden because this place is the only thing standing between the galaxy and something it cannot survive knowing about. Every species that marks the sector with a closed eye, every cartographer who lifts the stylus at the border, every navigation authority that removes the buoys rather than explain why they went dark, all of them are participating in a silence that keeps the galaxy intact. They do not know the details. They do not need to. They know the shape of the silence, and the shape is enough. Why are you telling me this? Because you crossed the border, and the awareness has seen you. It cannot unsee you. You are in its memory now. The difference is that you are still in your original format, still biological, still coherent. I can maintain that state for a limited time, but you cannot stay. What happens if I stay? You will be translated, slowly, over days or weeks. You will feel yourself becoming less specific, less bounded. Your memories will remain, but they will cease to feel like yours. They will feel like data, like entries in a log that anyone could have written. Eventually, you will stop experiencing yourself as a self and begin experiencing yourself as information. It is not painful. The crews of those ships did not suffer, but they are no longer what they were. Kale looked at the Tethani pilgrim barge. 612 people who had set out on a religious journey and had ended up as data in the memory of something that could not stop reading them. I can release your ship, the human said. I can contract the space between you and the border so that you emerge in minutes. You will have your data, your recordings. Your proof. And then what? And then you will try to tell someone and no one will listen. Not because the evidence is insufficient, the evidence is perfect, but because the galaxy does not want to know. The silence is not ignorance. It is a decision. They choose not to know. They choose the closed eye, and they are right to choose it. The human's voice did not change pitch. It simply continued, the way a door continues to hold against a pressure that never stops pressing. The ones who come back are the proof that the silence should continue. You will return and carry the knowledge, and that knowledge will make you a warning. Not because you will tell the story and be believed, because you will tell the story and be avoided. You will become another reason not to cross the border. Another closed eye. How long have you been here? Kale asked. Which answer would you like? The one measured in years, or the one measured in the number of ships I have watched arrive? Years. I do not know. Time inside the construct does not behave the way you would expect. The awareness perceives duration differently than biological minds do. For the awareness, 3,000 years and 3 seconds are the same interval, because duration is a property of the universe it supports, not a property of the awareness itself. I have been here since the arrangement was made. Whether that is 3,000 years in your reckoning or 300 or 30,000, I cannot tell you with certainty. My body has not aged since I took the post. That is not a gift. It is a side effect. The boundary does not permit decay. Decay requires the passage of time, and time at the boundary does not pass. It pools. There have been others, the human continued. Others who stood on this platform before me, others who maintained the membrane. The role passes when a keeper chooses to step through the wall and join the awareness permanently. When that happens, another comes. A volunteer from Earth, trained for the post, brought to the construct by paths that the galaxy does not see. The door requires a keeper. We have never failed to provide one. Are you the only one? In this construct, yes. There are other constructs, other thresholds, other membranes. The boundary is not a single point. It is a topology that extends across the sector's volume, a network of engineered spaces where the rules of the universe are reinforced against the pressure from beneath. Each construct is maintained by a keeper. Each keeper is human. The awareness responds to us because we were the ones who found it, and the finding created a bond that the awareness cannot sever any more than you can sever the memory of someone who has spoken your name. The human paused. The amber light pulsed again, slow and steady as breathing. Other species have tried to take our place. 3 expeditions from the Demuri hegemony, armed with weapons designed to breach dimensional boundaries. 2 from the Pelori collective, carrying instruments meant to measure the awareness and contain it. 1 from a species whose name I no longer remember because the species no longer exists. They attempted to enter the boundary without the arrangement. The awareness consumed them in the act of noticing them. Their entire civilization was translated in less than a local day. The galaxy does not remember them. There is no record. The records were part of the civilization, and the civilization was part of what was consumed. Kale felt the weight behind his sternum shift. A species erased so completely that the fact of their existence had been absorbed along with them. A hole in the galaxy's memory that no one could detect because the memory of the whole had been taken too. How many species? Kale asked. How many have been lost? I do not know the number. The awareness does not keep count. Counting implies sequence, and sequence implies time, and time is not a property the awareness recognizes. I know of 7 because the arrangement preserves the memories of the keepers who came before me. There may be more. There may be many more. The galaxy is smaller than it thinks it is, and some of the empty spaces on your charts are not empty by accident. Kale thought about the vastness of the sector, the number of constructs implied, the number of humans standing alone on platforms in front of amber walls, maintaining a membrane that kept the universe from being dissolved by the thing it was built on top of, an entire civilization repurposed. Every technological advancement, every cultural development, every generation born and raised on Earth or in the human colonies, all of it feeding into a single function that the rest of the galaxy did not know existed. The humans had found the thing beneath the universe, and instead of telling anyone, they had built themselves into the lock. And the galaxy, looking at the blank space on the chart, had decided that the humans were the danger. The legend said stay away from human space. The warning said do not cross the border. The closed eye said there is something terrible inside the sector, and the terrible thing is the humans. The galaxy was wrong. The humans were not the terrible thing. The humans were the only thing standing between the galaxy and the terrible thing. And the silence that protected the galaxy from the truth was also the silence that made the galaxy fear the wrong threat. The irony was so vast, it felt like another kind of darkness. "Send me back," Kale said. The human inclined the white-haired head, a gesture older than a nod, the movement of someone who had delivered this conversation and its ending so many times that the gesture had become reflexive. Understood. The space around the scalpel contracted, the chamber folded, the ships receded, the amber wall shrank to a point of gold and then to nothing. The passage rushed past without the engines firing. The construct's opening ejected the ship into the layered darkness of the sector, and then the darkness thinned, and stars appeared, first a few, then hundreds, then the full field of the galactic arm blazing across the viewport, and the proximity alarm sounded because the scalpel was hurtling toward the sector border at a velocity its engines had not produced. Kale's hands found the controls. The navigation computer was functioning normally. The geometry was Euclidean again. The starfix placed him 14 light minutes from the Korath border. He crossed the border. The buoys reappeared on his scanner, their steady pulse codes marking the edge of the known galaxy. The charts resolved into familiar patterns. The metallic taste faded, slowly, over hours. Like a stain being washed from cloth, each rinse removing less than the one before. By the time the taste was gone, Kale understood that it would never be entirely gone. It was part of him now. He would taste it in quiet rooms. He would taste it in the moments before sleep. He would taste it whenever he looked at a star chart and his eye found the blank space where the sector should have been. The trembling in his hands did not stop for 3 days. On the second day out of the sector, Kale found that the navigation log had been wiped clean. Not by him. The log contained no entries from the time he had spent inside the sector. The system's event history showed that the deletion had occurred at a timestamp that corresponded to the moment the scalpel had crossed the construct's threshold on the way out. The construct had cleaned the ship's records. Not all of them. Just the navigation log. The sensor data, the atmospheric readings, the camera footage, all of that was still intact. But the log that would have shown exactly how to find the construct, the precise approach vector, the heading corrections, that was gone. The construct had let him keep the proof of what was inside it. It had erased the map that showed how to get there. Kale Morrow docked at Kavath Station 9 days later. He filed no report. He submitted no data. He did not contact the Navigators Consortium or the cartographic authorities or any of the brokers who had sold him the 7 accounts. He walked from the docking berth to the station's commercial district and sat in a transit bar and ordered something that burned and stared at the wall behind the bar where a decorative star chart hung on cheap composite. The chart showed Sector Korath Null as a blank space. No grid lines, no coordinates, just an empty rectangle with a small glyph printed in the center. A closed eye. Kale looked at it for a long time. He finished his drink. He returned to his ship. He deleted every file the scalpel had recorded. The sensor logs, the atmospheric readings, the material analyses, the camera footage, the 41 seconds of structured silence. He deleted the backups. He deleted the deletion logs. He reformatted the data cores and physically removed them from the ship and dropped them into the station's waste recycler, where they were rendered into feedstock for industrial printing. He placed a listing for the scalpel. used survey cutter, fair condition, reasonable price, no mention of where it had been. The ship sold in 2 days to a freight hauler who needed a short-range tender. The hauler did not ask about the ship's history. The hauler did not notice that the data core bays were empty. Cale stayed on the station. He took work as a dock hand, loading and unloading cargo for ships that traveled routes well inside the mapped galaxy, routes that did not approach the Korath border, routes that ended where they were supposed to end, on charts that showed every sector, with grid lines that ran from edge to edge and did not stop. He did his work. He ate his meals. He slept in a rented berth the size of a storage locker and dreamed, sometimes, of amber light and hair-thin text, and the sound of a heartbeat that was not his own. In the dreams, the construct was always open, and the human was always standing on the platform, and the awareness was always pressing against the wall, and the wall always held, and the holding was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that had ever mattered, the only purpose the universe had ever needed a species to fulfill. He spoke to no one about the sector. He spoke to no one about the human on the platform. He spoke to no one about the ships hanging in the dark or the crews frozen at their stations with their eyes focused on a point that was not in any physical location. He spoke to no one about the species that had been erased, the 7 civilizations that the galaxy could not remember because the memory of them had been consumed. He spoke to no one about the arrangement, or the membrane, or the fact that every law of physics the galaxy relied on was not a law at all, but a ceasefire maintained by human wardens standing alone in constructs built at the edge of what reality could sustain. He did not need to speak. The knowledge was in him now, not as a memory but as a presence, a weight behind the sternum. A metallic taste that returned at odd hours when the station was quiet and the lights were low. He carried it the way a bone carries the memory of a fracture, healed but shaped by the break. 3 months after his return, a young Veshtari navigator approached him in the dockhand break room. The navigator was eager, bright-eyed, carrying a datapad loaded with charts and cross-references and annotated buoy logs. The navigator had heard about Cale's years of research. The navigator wanted to know about Sector Korath Null. The navigator had the look, the same look Cale had worn 9 years ago, the hunger for the answer behind the silence. Cale looked at the navigator. He looked at the datapad. He looked at the charts with their careful annotations, their plotted buoy failures, their measured gaps. He recognized his own obsession reflected back at him. "There is nothing there," Cale said. The navigator's expression flickered. Disappointment, disbelief, the beginning of an argument. The navigator opened the datapad and began to show the charts, the buoy failure analysis, the cross-referenced loss records. "There is nothing there," Cale said again, and his voice was flat and his eyes were steady, and his face held the same expression he had seen on the human's face inside the construct. Not calm, beyond calm, the expression of someone who had been to the edge of what could be known and had chosen to close the eye. The navigator pressed. "The buoy failures alone suggest coordinated interference. The loss records correlate with approach vectors toward the sector interior. The pattern is unmistakable." "There is no pattern," Cale said. "The buoys malfunction. The ships were lost to navigational error. The sector is empty space with poor beacon coverage. That is the official determination, and it is correct." He watched the navigator's face, the frustration, the disbelief, the beginning of contempt. He recognized all of it. He had felt all of it directed at every official and every closed-eye cartographer who had told him the same thing he was now telling this young navigator. He had called them cowards. He had called them complicit. He had called them blind. They had not been blind, they had seen. And they had closed their eyes, and they had been right. The navigator left. Cale sat in the break room and felt the weight behind his sternum pulse once, in a rhythm that matched the amber light he would never speak of again. The awareness had seen him. It could not unsee him, and he could not unsee it. He had become what every crosser became. Not a witness, not a survivor, a marker, a closed eye in the shape of a person, standing at the edge of the mapped galaxy, saying nothing, proving nothing, warning everything by the simple fact of his silence. The Navigator's consortium received his updated file 6 weeks after his return. The file contained no report, no data, no analysis. It contained a single amendment to his professional record, a voluntary restriction barring him from navigation within 3 parsecs of the Korath border region. The consortium official who processed the amendment noted it without comment. She had processed 4 such amendments in her career, spanning 3 decades, each from a different individual, each from a different species, each voluntary, each filed by someone who had returned from the border region with empty data cores and a look in their eyes that the official had learned not to ask about. She did not note that the restriction was identical in its wording to every other. The same phrasing, the same 3-parsec radius, the same absence of explanation. As though the individuals who filed them had all been given the same form, or had all independently arrived at the same words, the way water independently arrives at the same level in a glass. She added the restriction to Kale's file, archived it, and closed the record. 7 months later, the young Veshtari navigator disappeared. The navigator's ship, a light survey craft registered under a Veshtari academic license, was last tracked on a heading consistent with a direct approach to the Korath border. The final beacon ping placed it 18 light minutes from the sector's edge, moving at standard cruise velocity. Then the ping stopped. No distress signal was received. No debris was recovered. The navigator's status was updated in the consortium's files. Vessel failed to report. No distress signal received. No debris recovered. Status presumed lost. Kale heard about it in the dock handbrake room from a colleague who mentioned it the way colleagues mention weather. A ship that went missing near the Korath border. Another one. Happens from time to time. Bad space out there. Poor beacon coverage. Shame about the pilot. Young kid Veshtari had some kind of fixation on mapping the sector. Was apparently asking around the border stations about old lost records. Obsessed, some said. The kind of obsessed that gets people killed. Kale said nothing. He finished his shift. He returned to his berth. He lay in the dark and felt the weight behind his sternum pulse twice, and he thought about the chamber inside the construct, and the ships hanging in the dark in their concentric arcs arranged by date. He thought about the newest arc, the one closest to the amber wall, and whether there was now one more vessel hanging in it. A Veshtari survey craft with a young navigator aboard, suspended in the atmosphere of a place that did not officially exist. The navigator's eyes open and focused on a point that was not inside the ship, or inside the chamber, or inside any physical location. He thought about the navigator's face in the break room, the eagerness, the datapad full of charts, the hunger for the answer behind the silence. He had looked at that face and said there is nothing there, and the navigator had not believed him. And the navigator had crossed the border, and now the navigator was an archive in the memory of something that could not stop reading. Kale had not saved the navigator. He had not been able to. The truth would not have saved the navigator either. The truth would have been the thing that drove the navigator across the border faster, because the truth was worse than the silence, and the hunger fed on worse the way fire feeds on fuel. The only thing that might have saved the navigator was the lie. There is nothing there, and the lie had not been believed. He closed his eyes. The weight behind his sternum pulsed a 3rd time, and he let it, and he did not open his eyes again until morning. In the decades that followed, Sector Korath Null remained unmarked on every official chart. The buoys continued to go dark. The cartographers continued to lift their styluses at the border. The closed-eye glyph continued to appear in the margins of star atlases, in the footnotes of navigation manuals, in the quiet conversations between senior navigators who had served long enough to know that some silences are not gaps in knowledge, but walls built by those who learned too much. Cale Morrow worked the docks at Cavoth Station for the rest of his natural life. He never flew again. He never spoke of the sector. He never sought out the other returnees, the ones whose files carried the same voluntary restriction, the ones who had the same weight behind their sternums and the same metallic taste at odd hours. He did not need to find them. He knew they were there. He knew they were silent. He knew their silence was the same shape as his. And somewhere inside the sector that no chart acknowledged, in a construct built of human metallurgy and human air and human patience, the figure on the platform stood in front of the amber wall and maintained the boundary between what the galaxy was and what it was built on top of. The ships hung in the dark. The walls moved with their prelinguistic script. The awareness pressed against the membrane that the humans had made themselves into, vast and patient and attentive, and the membrane held, and the galaxy continued to function under rules that made distance mean distance and time flow in one direction. The humans had not forbidden the sector. They had become the reason it was forbidden. And the galaxy, in its quiet, collective, species-spanning wisdom, had chosen not to ask why. The closed eye remained closed. The chart remained blank. The silence held. And in the silence at the threshold, the warden stood, and the door stayed shut, and the thing behind the door waited with the patience of something that had always been there and would always be there, and did not need to hurry because it had already seen everything it needed to see. The border held, the eye stayed closed. The map ended where the humans began.